right. So now I want to read from this article. It says here, from Indians to colored people, the problem of racial categories and the persistence of the Chowans in North Carolina. This is written by Warren E. Miltier Jr. And this is from the North Carolina Historical Review, Volume 93, Number 1, from January 2016, pages 28 to 57, about 30 pages. From Indians to colored people, the problem of racial categories and the persistence of the Chowans in North Carolina. Warren E. Miltier Jr. All right, so real quick before we get into the article, just want a little bit of the common knowledge history of what they say of the Chowan Indians, right? So it says here, early history. This is Mashburn Genealogy Archives. It says, located in the cradle of North Carolina, the territory that is now Gates County was once inhabited by the Weapemeoc Indians, a branch of which later known as the Chowan or Chowanoc. All right, so original name, Weapemoc. All right, they might even have other names, you know. It is from Chowan that the name Chowan derives. Lawson's 1709 account of these Indians lists the Chowans as having a single town, that being on Bennett's Creek in present Gates County. Their strength was listed as 15 fighting men. Preliminary archaeological investigations undertaken in the late 1970s suggest that this settlement began about 500 AD, thus indicating an Indian site 1,200 years old when reported by Lawson. Amateur collectors throughout the county have for years unearthed sizable numbers of Indian artifacts, including weapons, coins, stone tools, and pottery shards. Right, so as you can see, they're telling you that they go at least minimum 1,200 years in that area. The Chowan people or the Weapemoc. All right, 1,200 years. All right, so we're on this other website. It says the Native Heritage Project, the Chowan Indians. It says here the Chowan Indians were found in North Carolina when Sir Walter Raleigh or Sir Walter de la Raleigh, Sephardic Jew Moor, military expedition visited in 1585, 1586. At that time, they were documented as the Chowanuk or Chowanoki. Later, the name was shortened to Chowan, and today the Chowan River is one of the few rivers left that memorializes the native tribe on the eastern seaboard. According to Rovelane's Raleigh's expedition leader in 1585, the Chowanoc had 19 villages, with the capital being the town of Chowanoki near present-day Harrisville and Hertford County, North Carolina. They were the most numerous and most powerful of the Algonquin tribes in North Carolina, right? They were Algonquin people, just like the Matamusket we got the other day. So they kind of like related to the Matamusket, the video we did recently. All right, so if you haven't seen that video, go ahead and check it out. All right, how they all were also misclassified and labeled people of color. All right, now again, this tribe here, the Chowan, Weapemoc, the Weapemoc, you know, original name as they were said before, were Algonquins, and they had traveled, you know, down. They had settled there, and again, they're saying at least 1,200 years. It says Lane described the town as being large enough to muster 700, 800 warriors, which meant that their total population was likely more than 3,000. Another later account by Harriet from the same expedition estimated that all the villages could muster 800 warriors. Lane's account was quite accurate in terms of his description of the town, its location, and structures. Archaeological excavations at the site of Chowanoki in the 1980s confirmed Lane's report of its location. The town had been occupied by humans for 800 years, with radiocarbon dating established 825 AD. All right, so we just came back from the other website where it was saying at least 1,200 years. All right, so again, their radiocarbon dates, are all questionable. Could even be a lot older. Says the town was a mile long and was home to several hundred Chowanoki people and possibly as many as 2,100. It contained a precinct for the ruler nobility or elite residences, public buildings, all right, temples, and burials near the north end of what the archaeologists called Area B, all right? So again, it wasn't just like teepees. It wasn't just one type of a house. It was many different things. Again, elite residences, public buildings, temples, and burials like cemeteries, you know. This may have been the 30 longhouse cluster observed and reported by Harriet. Evidence of other residences was found in areas of erosion on the edges of the peninsula. All right, so we're back in the article again. From Indians to colored people, the problem of racial categories and the persistence of the Chowans in North Carolina. Remember, these people have been there for a while, Algonquin tribe. It says here, a defeat in a years-long engagement with English colonists in 1677 ushered in a momentous political and social changes for the Chowan people of eastern North Carolina. Since the arrival of Sir Walter Raleigh's Sephardic Jew, right, pirate contingent at the end of the 16th century, the Chowans had remained sovereign in the face of colonists' encroachment on their land. Yet the terms of the 1677 settlement with the English, remember, so-called English, remember my video, nuts, Virginia's and including now North Carolina's not so English colonies, all right? A lot of these people, again, were Huguenots, Puritans, Protestants, Sephardic Jews, more, you know, people were being persecuted by the Catholics. A lot of these people were people of color, right? So we got to dodge the hijack thinking, you know, Christian, English, white people, because we've already corrected that. All right, so let's stay focused on the past information and apply it to what we're reading right now. Again, so yet the terms of 1677 settlement with the English set the Chowans on the path to political collapse and led to the surrender of all their land claims. In the 1677 treaty, terms transformed the Chowans from a self-governing collective into tributary reservation Indians under the authority of the colonial government. Noting the political decline of the Chowans through the 17th and 18th centuries, William S. Powell, in his time-tested narrative of North Carolina history, assumed that the Chowans were extinct by 1820. All right, they said you were extinct. They assumed. You think they only assumed, or did they do that on purpose? Paper genocide, huh? In reality, as this article shows, Chowan descendants continued to live near their homeland after this point, and few Chowan descendants still live on the lands once part of the Chowan Reservation. Modern historians have overlooked Chowan persistence because the local government classified Chowan descendants as colored persons instead of Indians. Oh, wow, really? They did what? They classified American indigenous people, right? Chowan descendants, Weapemeoc, the Weapemoc descendants as colored persons, so-called Negroes, instead of Indians during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. All right? It's not me saying that. We ain't making this up. Since the late 1980s, a small group of scholars has begun to uncover the lives of Native people, documented simply as people of color. Again, since the late 1980s, a small group of scholars has begun to uncover the lives of Native people, documented simply as people of color. All right, and that group of scholars is now all of us right now. We're in this group now, and it's a bigger group now. All right, because we're researching and we're correcting history. We're seeing that there's a whole different story here that was never told to us. A lot of narratives change, and they're going to say assumed, but a lot of this was done on purpose. We already know, right? Manifest destiny and all that other stuff. Papa Boo. Oh, yeah, we got you a bull right here. Got you bull right here. People of color, and connected the histories of people categorized as Indians with those classified as colored. So it just continues, says this article builds on that work and links the legacy of the Chowan Indians to the lives of their colored descendants. Yet unlike some of these studies, this article goes beyond viewing the recategorization of the Chowans and like groups as form of documentary genocide or denial of the Indianness of Indians, and instead demonstrates that racial categories are inherently unreliable markers of social cohesion and ancestral connections. Indian, colored, and other concepts are constructs of the imagination, not cogent signifiers of human difference. All right, they're kind of saying, these are all tags really at the end of the day. As sociologists have explained, race, ethnicity, and nationality exist only in and through our perceptions, interpretations, representations, classifications, categorizations, and identifications. They are not things in the world, but perspectives on the world. Indian, in parentheses, as an imagined concept, originates from the colonial encounter and the desire to distinguish collectively the indigenous people of the Americas from Europeans. The recategorization of the Chowans from Indians to colored persons is an example of what Anne Laura Stoller describes as when common sense rubrics of racial differentiation failed to work. The Indian of Europeans' imagination simply could not encompass the variety of political and social changes that the Chowans and other native people have experienced from the colonial period through the present. Local officials in Gates County, North Carolina, the site of the Chowan Reservation and other northeastern North Carolina localities where Chowan descendants lived, classified Chowan descendants as people of color instead of Indians for reasons related to changes in the Chowans' political status and lifeways. When Europeans first began to use Indian as a collective racial label for native peoples, they developed sets of characteristics they believed made Indians distinct from other people. In the minds of Europeans, Indians were bound to specific lands as shown by the many maps produced during the earliest years of colonization. Map makers linked native peoples' names with certain pieces of land. As long as they remain on those lands or the reservations exchanged for those lands, European settlers believed they existed as distinct groups and maintained an essential Indian quality. In turn, natives people who no longer possessed these lands could no longer be Indians under the colonizers' definition. Colonial and early national officials believed that landless Indians could not be Indians at all. You hear this? Just remember, these are all perspective of these people, right? So we're going to dodge the hijack big time. What we are clearly seeing is that they are admitting, right? What are they admitting? Indians being later classified as people of color. I know they're trying to go somewhere else with it. We got to dodge the hijack. Remember, this is written in 2016. They're coming with their, slave narratives and their out of Africa theories too. Remember that. And that all Europeans are white. So let's dodge the hijack. Let's not forget, while I'm reading this, I know you guys are doing it, discerning the information. Without a land base, they lost the feature that distinguished them from other non-white peoples. Other non-white peoples. What are these non-white people? If they're not Indians, who are these non-white people? I know they're gonna say, well, Kurimeo, they're talking about, the Africans that were brought. No, there's other people of color there, right? That have nothing to do with so-called white. After their defeat in 1677, the Chowans endured a long series of land confiscations that would eventually leave them without collective ownership of their reservation land holdings. They couldn't even remember what had happened. Their descendants, listen to what's going on. Together, these events caused the Chowans' neighbors to perceive them as no longer Indians and justified their recategorization. When the English arrived in their territory, the Chowans were one of the strongest nations in the region. Theodore de Bry's 1590 map shows that they maintained at least 5 towns along the Chowan River. During his trip to the region in the 1580s, English explorer Ralph Lane estimated that they possessed 700 fighting men at the town of Chawanook. Traveling through Chowan territory in 1622, writer John Porey described their lands as rich in resources. After 1677, however, North Carolina's colonial government confiscated much of the Chowans' homeland and left them with a 12 square mile strip of land on Bennett's Creek in Chowan County, now Gates County. You see, so they were taking their land and they were doing it unlawfully, illegally. They were probably not following treaties and things like that. Before the end of the century, their white neighbors, so-called white neighbors, remember 1600s, what white neighbors? Prove to me these are pale-skinned people. Because the history of the people who were coming in is saying something else, and we've gone over it, all right? So again, remember, let's dodge the hijack. This is written in 2016. So before the end of the century, their European neighbors, all right, we're going to switch white for European neighbors, began to encroach upon their lands, and the colonial government refused to survey the boundaries of this reservation, which further reduced the Chowans' land holdings. In 1694, the Chowans complained to colonial officials about settlers trespassing on their reservation lands. Now listen to this. They had reservations way back in the 1600s already. They were already being put in reservations, put into this one spot when they used to be able to travel everywhere, right? So earlier when they said that the maps were trying to put people in specific areas, we know that's not true, because we know that, we did trade, people traveled, even though they were certain areas, but they were always spread out and traveling and all that. They weren't just in one place. They were constantly doing trade and all that. So these people were put into reservations way back in the 1600s, way before a lot of other tribes. They were already going through that. They were already complaining in 1694, right? Their officials responded by declaring that settlers could move no farther into Chowan territory, but the colonists eventually seized nearly all the Chowan land. By the first decade of the 18th century, only 6 square miles of the original reservation remained under Chowan control. The colonists continued to threaten the Chowans and their Bennett's Creek reservation by falsely accusing them of unwarranted hostility and aggression. In 1702, 8 of the Chowans' neighbors complained to the General Court that the Chowan Indians, having their hunting quarters upon some of your petitioners' land aforesaid, therefore do pretend the said lands to be theirs, notwithstanding the patents and grants aforesaid. So they're like complaining, like, yo, hey, they ain't going by their treaties. They keep coming out of their reservations. They don't want to stay in their reservations. So that's what they're complaining about. They charged the Chowans with destroying their stock, burning their houses, and other hostilities. I wonder why they were doing that, right? The petitioners sought a remedy that would affirm their rights to the land in dispute, but they also seemed to understand that the Chowans had a clear rationale for their attacks, right? Like I just said, they had a clear rationale for what they were doing. What's your excuse for colonizing and invading and making people go into a reservation? Colonists recognized that the Indians were under the colonial government's protection, and no Englishman out to seat within 4 miles of their town, all right, so-called Englishmen. Even without a survey, the Chowans asserted their rights to particular pieces of territory and sought to defend those areas from the settler encroachment. The petitioners, however, tried to use the uncertainty of the Chowans' territorial boundaries to their own benefit by claiming the disputed territory, land that Chowans viewed as part of their reservation. The Chowans' neighbors used their petition as a way to claim land they knew belonged to the Chowans by redefining the Chowans' attempt to protect their reservation as a tax on settlers. The petitioners sought to appear lawful and cooperative, suggesting that they wanted to purchase their right, if any, to the land, in order to continue peace and tranquility with the said Indians. But for the rest of the 18th century, the colonists manipulated the legal system to challenge the Chowans' title to their land and to claim parts of the reservation. You see, they were just being sneaky, really. They had agendas. The Chowans sought to clarify the boundaries of the reservation in order to protect their land. After the Tuscarora English conflict of the 1710s, John Hitter, acting as leader of the Chowans, petitioned the colonial government for a settlement of the Bennett's Creek Reservation boundaries. Hitter contended that the colonists owed the Chowans this settlement of the boundaries after the Chowans had suffered great losses in supporting the colonists against their Indian enemy, the Tuscarora. All right? He clearly understood that the original agreement between the Chowans and colonists guaranteed the Chowans a 12 square mile reservation. Nevertheless, he was willing to accept 6 square miles if clearly allotted. After decades of ignoring the Chowans' appeals, the colonial council granted Hitter's request and ordered a survey of the reservation tract. Without scruples, the colonial government allowed a survey that pushed the Chowans onto the worst acreage of the original land grant. You see what they did? They gave them the worst part of the land. They just pushed them there. You guys get to keep that, when they were the original owners, as you can say, but they weren't really owners because the Indians didn't own land, but they were the original inhabitants of that whole area that the Great Spirit gave to them. Hawa. But now they're being pushed onto the worst acreage of the original land grant. Following the survey, Hitter complained that no part or parcel of G said land and G said tract laid out will produce corn, being all pines and sands and deserts. They can't even grow there. You see what they did? This was a problem because the land grant for the reservation required the Chowans to pay a yearly tribute in corn. So they couldn't even do their tribute because they're putting them in this desolated part of the land, right, where they can't really grow. So they're already setting up for failure. You see what they're doing, right? They're trying to exterminate them. They're being slick. They know they ain't going to be able to grow there. They're stuck in the worst part of the land, and they're still going to owe corn where they can't grow. They're setting them up for failure. You see how messed up this is, right? He also believed that the tract surveyed was not near 6 miles square. Although the Chowans held only the worst part of their original claim after the survey, neighboring colonists, all right, continued to pursue additional parcels of the reservation. So even after that, people are still trying to take those little pieces of that bad land that they got stuck with. By the 1730s, colonists, right? Who's these colonists? Remember, it's a more and more war, sought to purchase Chowan lands outright. Likely desperate for money to procure supplies and foodstuff, the Chowans sold several tracts. In 1733, Thomas Hitter, considered at least by the colonists as the chief of the Chowans, along with James Bennett, Jeremiah Pushin. These are the chiefs? Are you serious? Thomas Pushin, Charles Beasley, John Redding, and News Will participated in at least 6 land sales. The largest tract sold during this year was a 500-acre parcel purchased by James Hinton for 100 pounds. All right, 500 acres for 100 pounds. Further diminishing the reservation, Michael Ward, John Freeman, and Jacob Hinton each purchased 200 acres from the Chowans. Now, if you do a genealogical history on these people, you might end up finding out something deep. And this is what I'm trying to tell you. All right, we're still in the 1700s here. Ward, I believe that's an Arabic Muslim name, Ward, paid the Chowans 60 pounds for his tract, while the Chowans received double the amount for the same number of acres from Freeman. The Chowans also sold Henry Hill 50 acres for 50 pounds. Thomas Taylor purchase of 100 acres of land for 200 pounds was the most anyone paid the Chowans for land that year, right? So this is history. They're kind of like selling the land. Now, are they doing this voluntarily or what's going on, right? That's a whole different story. All right, so this is like a letter here written, I believe, from that time. It says, after supporting North Carolina in the Tuscarora War, John Hitter petitioned North Carolina leaders for a resettlement of the Chowan Reservation's boundaries. He complained that the land set aside for the Chowans would not produce the corn necessary to feed his people. Hitter's undated petition from the State Archives of North Carolina Raleigh. You see, this is how he wrote. So who's funny how this almost looked like Arabic, the way they're, Arabic English. Continuing, it says the land sales of 1733 were just the beginning of several, likely desperate sales by the Chowans. All right, likely desperate. They were desperate. Something was going on. For the next 2 years, Thomas Hitter, James Bennett, remember Bennett? See, this is what I'm trying to tell you guys. Bennett is a Sephardic Jewish name. Bennett was actually the supposed slave owner that owned Anthony Johnson before he was freed. He was Bennett, right? He was under Bennett. So Bennett, we know. So now they're saying these are the chiefs, right? Who are these chiefs? Are they half Indian, half Sephardic Jews and Moors? How did they become chiefs with these English names, right? Or they just get baptized these names, Sephardic Jewish names. All right, that's conjecture. All that we have to do a real research, and we are gonna do that. All right, I'm gonna go look into this, and I already know Bennett and all these names. A lot of these are Sephardic and Moorish names. Bennett goes back to Baruch Bennett, or blessed. All right, it says Jeremiah pushing. All right, Jeremiah, Hebrew name, Charles Beasley, John Robbins, News Will, John Bailey, and John Redden, referred to in several deeds as chief men of the Chowan Indians, sold additional land. So all these people are selling the land. Who are these chiefs with these names, right? All land sales by the Chowans legally required the approval of the colonial government, and in an alleged attempt to curb the colonists' abilities to seize native lands without proper payment and title, North Carolina officials passed an act banning white men or Europeans from purchasing those lands without permission from the governor and governor's council under the penalty of 20 pounds per 100 acres. A 1735 meeting of the North Carolina government's council fulfilled this requirement and approved 10 of the deeds recorded between 1733 and 1735. Late in the same year, the council approved an 11th deed to Colonel Henry Bonner. The territory under Chowan control continued to decline into the 1740s, with sales of two of the Chowan's most aggressive neighbors. For several decades, Aaron and Ephraim Blanchard, right? Aaron, Ephraim, two Hebrew names. Aaron, Ephraim, two Hebrew names. We are not talking about Israeli people, Ashkenazi people at this time. I'm telling you. Sephardic Jewish people mostly. A lot of these merchants, a lot of these people settling. Again, they were being persecuted by the Catholics, so they were finding new homes here in America. They had challenged their land rights. In 1717, John Hitter had reported the Blanchards to colonial officials for illegally encroaching on the Bennett's Creek Reservation. During a 1735 meeting, the governor's council ordered Aaron to release a patent for the reservation, which he had kept from the Chowans, who were the patent's rightful owners. Yet in 1745, the Chowans finally conceded to the Blanchards' long-term desires. 2 decades after the original deed was allegedly signed by the Chowans, the Chowan County clerk recorded a deed from Thomas Hitter and James Bennett to the Blanchards. In that transfer, the Chowans ceded 460 acres of reservation lands. Whatever the circumstances that led to this transaction, so they don't know. So now why are these people selling their people's land? Tell me, man. Be honest. Let's not be all, oh, Kurimeo, they got those names. You know, yeah, they might have been Indians who got baptized those names. Maybe not, though. That's conjecture until we can prove it, right? Because most of the time when I go research this stuff, they actually end up being half Indian, half Europeans, the sons of a princess, and the marriage between a Sephardic Moor or whatever, and they become the chiefs, and that's usually the case. So they don't know why these people are actually selling the land at this point, why they're giving them so much land, right? 460 acres. They don't know what circumstances led to this transaction, you know? Why are they selling their people's land like that? According to the law, the sale was not binding without approval of the governor's council. Nonetheless, officials never took action to enforce the law on behalf of the Chowans. The Chowan County clerk recorded another equally questionable deed. All right, another questionable deed. All right, are these deeds actually really happening? You know, that's the other thing. Are they making up these deeds and saying, "Hey, look, we signed, they said it's cool"? Did they really verify all this stuff? It wasn't approved by the governor's council. So that could be another thing they're saying right here. So these questionable deeds, right? Because why would they be selling so much land, their people's land, to these other people, right? So another equally questionable deed of sale in 1745 that led to an even greater loss for the Chowan people. The recorded deed explained that in 1744, Thomas Hitter and John Robbins, in exchange for 100 pounds, transferred 640 acres of the reservation to Henry Hill. After the sale, James Bennett complained to colonial officials that his fellow Chowans had no right to sell the reservation lands. You see what's going on? He's like, hey, hold up. They didn't have no right to be selling all this land for us. We didn't let them. They weren't doing that on behalf of all of us. They had no right. The governor's council called Henry Hill, Thomas Hitter, and John Robbins in order to discuss the situation. Whether the council met any of the men is unclear. They don't even know if they even met or did anything about it. But the deed remained on the books in Chowan County without any change noted in the agreement. You see what's going on? Why were these people really selling the land? Who were these people, and were they really about their people? By the 1750s, the Chowans living on the reservation had dwindled to only a few families, which likely forced the Chowans to sell more land in order to survive. By this period, the population on the reservation had fallen to a point that mounting any type of defense against encroaching colonists, as the Chowans had done at the beginning of the century, would have been nearly impossible. A population census of natives people counted only 2 men, 3 women, and 2 children left among the Chowans. Can you believe that? That sounds like a family, like a one family. Can you believe that? They're probably just reclassifying everybody else, right? They can't be the only ones left. You're still here. The 2 men counted most likely were James Bennett and John Robbins. You hear that? That was the people selling the land. The only Chowan signatories of deeds during the decade. They were the only ones signing these deeds and everything. Again, questionable deeds. Bennett is a Sephardic Jewish name. Bennett, all right, and John Robbins, the only Chowan signatories of deeds during the decade. On May 27, 1754, the Chowans, with the assistance of Henry Hill, sold 150 acres running along the Bennett Creek to their longtime neighbor, Jacob Hinton, Jacob, Hebrew, for 20 pounds. In 1754 and 1755, Bennett and Robbins sold 2 tracts of land, one containing 200 acres and another encompassing 100 acres, to Richard Freeman. The Chowans received only 20 pounds and 12 pounds respectively for the tracts. North Carolina Governor Arthur Dobbs and his council never approved any of these deeds as required by law. You hear that? You see, they were doing foul things. Why? And why they had these European names and they're the chiefs, and that why they're doing all these deeds without the approval of the government? They had no protection. Any of their family members, anybody could have been selling land, and nobody was regulating it. And that wasn't part of the treaty. That was not supposed to happen to the Chowan people. So Arthur Dobbs and his council, the governor, right? They never approved any of these deeds as required by law, but no record exists that shows that these sales were contested. But nobody ever contested it. Nobody ever contested this stuff. And you know how many times this happened, not just to the Chowans, but so many other native people or indigenous people of America, where all these deeds that were false deeds, these grants were being abused, and these deeds weren't being contested. This is a great example, and this is why I want to read this to you guys. Hope you guys enjoying the presentation. Now it says illegal sales of Chowan territory carried on into the 1760s and 1770s and further diminished reservation resources. In 1760, the Chowan County Clerk recorded a land sale from James Bennett to Chowan nemesis Aaron Blanchard. So if that was the Chowan's enemy, why would Bennett be selling land to him if he's a Chowan, right? Why would he be doing that to his own people, selling land to their enemy or nemesis? Nearly 3 exchanging 600 acres of land for 35 pounds. Nearly 3 years later, the clerk recorded another deed between James Bennett and James Bennett Jr. and Amos Bennett, all described as Chowan Indians with parentheses. They're described. Are they really Chowan Indians only? Are they really Chowan Indians? And what really happened to the actual Weapemoc? Remember, their name was the Weapemoc before the ch sound. That ch, that word, they had different names. The Tasalagi, right? The Cherokee Tasalagi, the Tasalagi. Again, the Weapemoc. The Weapemoc, as it said on the other website, that was the original name. They were all described as Chowan Indians with parentheses, and Elijah Hunter, which transferred 700 acres of reservation land containing marsh and Pocasson in exchange for 4 pounds, In 1770, the clerk recorded a similar deed transferring 640 acres from the three Chowan men to Thomas Garrett for slightly better rate of 15 pounds. So these dudes, these street dudes, Bennett's, they're selling all their people's land. Wow. This sale violated not only North Carolina law, but also a general order issued by British authorities that required approval from the Board of Trade for all land sales from Indians. After these sales, James Bennett Jr., and Amos Bennett no longer appear in Chowan County records. You hear that? They disappeared. They're no longer Indians. They did their job. They're no longer anywhere in the records. They got their money, disfranchised the people that were the Weapemoc, mixed in, amalgamated with them or whatever, put some of them in indentured servitude, reclassified them, put them in little corners, reservations, then sold it all. And then no longer they're recorded after that. Where did they go? What happened to these people? So they no longer appear in Chowan County records. From this point, women and children appear to have been the only Chowans still inhabiting the reservation. Only women and children. What happened to the men? What did these Bennetts do to the rest of the men and the warriors? Remember, there was about 800 warriors. Now there's only children and women left. Like these recorded in 1740s and 1750s, none of these transfers was approved by colonial authorities. You see what was going on? That's wrong. All skinfolk ain't kinfolk, and it's not about a black or white thing. It's just people being people. European colonists came and did their things. They had to survive. These are all people of color, so they weren't looking at each other's complexion. They weren't doing it because of each other's complexion, what they were doing. None of those deeds were ever approved by colonial authorities. All right? 20 years after the transaction involving the Bennetts, some of the Chowan neighbors decided to pursue remnants of the reservation and end all collective claims of the Chowans. A final sale, which officially completed in 1792, led to the termination of the Chowan reservation. All right? In 1790, right? 1790, right when the first census came out, right? William Lewis and Samuel Harrell pushed a few young Chowan men to cooperate in the transfer of the last vestiges of the reservation. That year, representatives drew up a conveyance between James Robbins, Benjamin Robbins, George Bennett, and Joseph Bennett, all described as chief men and representatives of the Chowan Indians Nation of the County of Gates, and William Lewis and Samuel Harrell transferring all the remaining reservation land in exchange for 100 Spanish milled dollars. Obscuring the reliability of the information contained in the deed is a note in the deed book referencing the Chowan signing of the deed. Only 3 of the 4 Chowans mentioned in the transfer actually signed the deed. According to the note, Benjamin Robbins was not present at the deed signing, and James Robbins signed on his behalf. The deed claims that the Chowans remained an Indian nation, and although the sale, like many others before it, appeared to be legal, the federal government alone was empowered to deal with Indian nations. Thus, the transaction was illegal. Again, another illegal transaction. Yet Lewis and Harrell sought to obscure the illegality of the sale by consulting with the General Assembly and seeking its approval for the sale. Obtaining approval from the state would at least meet the precedent of other land transfers approved by the North Carolina government during the colonial period, and make the state a party in any later objections to the land sale if they ever happened to come up in federal court. So they were like trying to cover their tracks. Lewis and Harrell sent a petition to the General Assembly asking for approval of the 1790 land sale in an attempt to describe the remaining Chowans as legitimate holders of the land and at the same time not truly Indians. They explained that the whole of the said Chowan Indian men is dead. They said, oh, they're all dead, leaving a parcel of Indian women which has mixed with Negroes. Now they're calling them Negroes, right? And now there is several freemen and women of mixed blood, as aforesaid, which have descended from the said Indians. All right, so you see how what they're trying to do, even way back in the 1790s, in the early 1800s, they're trying to paper genocide you, and they start calling you so-called Negroes. Maybe Lewis and Harold believed describing the Chowans such. Now they're saying mixing with Negroes. What Negroes? That could mean so many things. That could be indigenous people. That could be Sephardic Jews, Moors, Carib Indians being brought up from the Caribbean, any other indigenous person brought up from America. That could mean a lot of things. So let's just, but either way, they're trying to say they killed all the men, or what happened to the men? They just disappeared. Somebody's trying to cover their tracks and give reasons as to why it was legal for them to sell the land. So maybe Lewis and Harold, all right, so these two guys, right, they were up to science scheming. Maybe Lewis and Harold believed describing the Chowans as such would persuade the General Assembly to ignore the mandate of the federal government in transactions with Indians. Emphasizing the Chowans had mixed with Negroes would have convinced state representatives that the Chowans were no longer true Indians. Lewis and Harold's mixed blood claim was part of their strategy to dispossess the Chowans. All right, you see that? So what did they use to try to dispossess Indians? They started calling you so-called Negroes, right? Didn't that happen to all of them? Right? They started using that word to disfranchise you so you wouldn't be considered indigenous anymore, so-called Indian, indigenous. Right? What? The word Negro. They started calling you Negroes. So they try to use that against the Chowans. Like, well, look, they're Negroes. They're not Indians. But that was their strategy again, to dispossess the Chowans, not necessarily an accurate reflection of the Chowans' familial patterns, for no other document supports or refutes their contention. What mixing? Mixing with who? You're just saying that. What Negroes? What are you talking about? Show me the marriage records. Show me the birth certificates. Show me who they were mixing with. What are you talking about? This is exactly what they just said in this paper, right? It doesn't reflect the Chowans' familial patterns. No, they weren't doing that. For no other documents support or refute their contention, all right? There's no proof of what they're saying. In 1792, the General Assembly and Governor Alexander Martin ignored federal law and approved the sale of the last pieces of the Bennett's Creek Reservation, ending the reservation period for the Chowans and setting up the rationale for the story of their disappearance. All right, that's when they started paper genocide. The deed for the land sale was the last time Gates County officials clearly defined any Chowan descendant as Indians. The final land sale signified to their neighbors that the Chowans who no longer fit the stereotype. Why? Because they changed the stereotype. They changed the way the Indian was supposed to look. They changed the stereotype so they no longer fit it. Not that they were mixing with me. They no longer fit it, meaning they were looking like it, but then all of a sudden they didn't fit it anymore. All of a sudden they didn't fit the stereotype that Indians were unequally bound to the land. Were not truly Indians, but simply colored people. They were simply colored people. Forget about the Indians. They just call them colored, okay? Okay, all right? This is a scholarly article right here. Many sources, many footnotes. All right, the North Carolina Historical Review, volume 93. What did they do? They said that you were no longer truly Indian, but simply colored people. You simply colored people. In the minds of local record keepers, the Chowans' descendants remained, but one they perceived as Indian lived in Gates County. Here, changes in political coherence and lifeways provided local officials with their justifications to classify the Chowans of people of color instead of Indians. You hear this? Defeat in the War of 1670s made the Chowans tributaries to the royal government and forced Chowans in the early 18th century to consult with North Carolina officials in order to express grievances about settler encroachment. During the reservation period, the Chowans experienced internal political collapse and lost control of their own affairs. Through the last years of the reservation, the Chowans depended on the local county court to adjudicate disputes with colonists, as well as to settle internal quarrels. By the end of the 18th century, They were no longer political sovereigns, but the subjects and dependents of local elites. Why? Because they started calling you so-called colored, because they started calling you Negro. You became, wow, a subject and dependence of who? Local elites, not so-called white men, local elites. Who's these elites? Similarly, alterations in dress, housing, social networks, and labor practices demonstrated to local officials that the Chowans were moving further away from the earlier traditions that non-natives perceived as Indian. Some Europeans and their American descendants did not believe that Indian lifeways could evolve, but the Chowans were never stagnant. Instead, they adapted to changing circumstances. Individual Chowans and their descendants made choices based on what they believed to be best for their futures and those of their families. They did not seek to conform to local officials' definition of Indian for the sake of maintaining a specific racial categorization. By the first decades of the 1700s, the Chowans had already adopted many European farming techniques and raised livestock like their colonist neighbors, all right? Just like the Europeans, both black and white, all right? Not just pale skin. Soon after the end of the North Carolina War against the Tuscaroras, John Hitter described many of the agricultural goods produced by his people, including articles that would have been unheard of by his ancestors before contact, all right? Among his list were hogs and horses, right? Hogs, pigs. We didn't have that over here. We weren't even hunting or eating pigs like that. We had wild boars, you know, but they weren't like the albino looking pigs that they brought, you know, the Spaniards and Moors, you know, that they brought when they first came, which the Chowans raised along with fruit orchards and corn. The Chowans had also begun to use fences to protect their livestock and crops and mark the boundaries of their land. This practice, along with raising livestock, marked an evolution in Chowan agricultural techniques, but it did not mean that the Chowans rejected the older farming ways. Instead, they adopted methods that would allow them to survive in a rapidly changing world. As new generations rose and older ones faltered, the Chowans' neighbors may have perceived them as different from their ancestors, yet in many ways the Chowans of the 1700s were the same as those who came before them. It is uncertain when the Chowans incorporated Christianity into their lives, but by the 1710s the Chowans had learned some of the basic tenets of that religion. In 1712, Giles Rainsford, an English missionary who stayed in the Chowan Indian town for 5 months, reported that I had several conferences with one Thomas Hitter, king of the Chowan Indians, who seemed very inclinable to embrace Christianity and proposed to send his son to school to Sarum to have him taught to read and write by way of foundation in order to further proficiency for the reception of Christianity. All right, so look what they're saying. They're saying that this Hitter guy who was selling all this land too, supposed to be a Chowan Indian, who was selling all his land too, right? Hitter, you know, what is the genealogical history of that name, huh? And he was really very inclinable to embrace Christianity, and he wanted to send his son to be a Christian. Why was he adapting all these European things and also selling land to Europeans? Why? If he was Chowan, why was he doing this to his people? During these conferences, Rainford offered to teach Hitter's son, but Hitter declined until a general peace was concluded between the Indians and the Christians. Whether Rainford eventually had the opportunity to teach Hitter's son is unclear. However, Rainford noted that even before his visit, the Chowans had previously demonstrated some knowledge of the Christian religious narrative. In his correspondence, Rainford explained that Hitter already had some notions of Noah's flood. All right, so that's not even that Noah flood story that was here before Europeans got here. So that was a bad example, honestly. Hitter's understanding of the biblical Noah undoubtedly resulted from over a century of contact and exchange between the Chowans and Europeans. Or how about another example? Maybe he had Sephardic Jewish ancestry or Muslim, and they knew about Noah and the Hebrews and the Ishmaelites and all this biblical stuff. Huh? You see how they're leaving that out, right? Because they want you to think they were just mixing with white Christian English people. Akin to other native peoples with generations of contact with European colonists, the Chowan slowly integrated their neighbors' forms of dress into their lives, right? So they started dressing like Europeans, right? Yet they're saying they were mixing with Negroes, right? And these are supposed to be Africans, so why didn't they integrate a little bit of the African clothing too, you know? The Natural History of North Carolina, written and published in the 1730s, John Brickell described how the Chowan leader Thomas Hitter and his people, along with other leaders of the civilized Indians, all right, amongst the civilized, so they were considered civilized Indians, like the 5 civilized tribes, right? But this Thomas Hitter and Bennett, they were selling land. They wanted to be Christians. What's up with these people, really? All right. It said that he presented themselves to North Carolina's royal governor at tribute ceremonies. Like the leaders of the neighboring Tuscaroras and Yopims, Thomas Hitter adopted the colonist dress when visiting the governor. He dressed just like them. Maybe he was just like them. Brickell wrote that Hitter wore a soldier's red coat, waistcoat, and breeches, with all other conveniences for wearing apparel. This dress, however, was only for special occasions. Hitter did not wear these garments on the reservation. Those people who accompanied Hitter on the meeting with the governor also adopted colonist dress. Brickell observed that a woman in Hitter's entourage wore a petticoat and decorated her hair with a variety of colorful materials. By dressing in this fashion during tribute meetings, the Chowans displayed their keen understanding of the colonists' ways and the value of dressing in manner designed to convey equality. Oh, really? Is that why they were doing it? Honestly, like, really, man? Like, is that really why they were doing it? Right? This Hitter guy who's selling all this land and embracing Christianity, maybe he was half. By this period, Hitter's dress in particular had become the preferred ceremonial outfit of native leaders along the Atlantic seaboard, the European ways, all right? Unlike the ceremonial use of colonist dress, the adoption of colonist housing styles altered the daily life patterns of the Chowans. Like his counterparts Thomas Blunt of the Tuscarora and John Duran of the Yopim, Thomas Hitter lived in what Brickell described as a house, fashioned and built after the manner that the Christians built theirs, right? Again, so who's this Thomas Hitter who's doing everything just like the Europeans and selling his people's land? The adoption of their neighbors' dwelling style likely was connected to a change in Chowan movement patterns forced onto relatively small reservations. The Chowans and other eastern North Carolina natives people had become sedentary like the colonists. Dwelling had to last for many years, right? So again, before that, they weren't sedentary, meaning they were on the move all the time. So they weren't just, stuck on one place like they try to make it seem like Indians were. And for that reason, the Chowans probably modeled their homes after that, the sturdy, efficient structure built by the colonists. An even more important alteration was the Chowans' weakening political situation. Before gaining tributary status in the late 1600s, the Chowans had dealt with issues of justice in their own manner, with little interference from colonists. After their submission to the colonial government, Chowans became increasingly dependent on colonial institutions to settle disputes. Since becoming a tributary people, the Chowans had regularly consulted with colonial officials in order to settle problems between themselves and the colonists. The involvement of local courts in Chowans disputes dealt a severe blow to Chowan political sovereignty. But the local court determination to invade Chowan home life caused the complete collapse of Chowan independent political activity. After the Bennett sold significant parts of the Chowan Reservation during the 1760s and early 1770s, the Chowan County Court began to take Chowan boys, all right? They began to do what? Take the boys, the indigenous boys, from their mothers and apprentice those boys to local whites or local Europeans. Apprentice, local Europeans, apprentice, indentures, not slaves. See, in history, they will be known as slaves. With the apparent removal of the Bennett men from the reservation in the 1770s, the reservation was depleted of Chowan men. You hear that? They took all the men. Remember earlier I said, so what happened to all the men? Why is there only women and children, Look what they were doing. All right, apprenticing, just like the Matamasket, they were trying to give them a job, give them a profession, make them servants, give them a trade. It might have been family members they worked for, an apprentice, you know. But what I'm trying to show you is that eventually these people would be known in history if they were considered so-called black or dark-skinned as Negroes from, coming from Africa, That's what they would classify them. And that's what they did classify them when they was telling us history when we were young. With no men on the reservation, local officials may have believed that the time had arrived for them to play a paternalistic role and take over internal reservation affairs. In 1772, the court bound James Robbins' son, Anne Robbins, to Dempsey Hinton. This practice persisted into the national period. Listen to this, under the administration of the Gates County Court, because you might find this when you're doing genealogy, you might find records like this. And I have found records like this when I'm doing people's genealogy. It says this practice persisted into the national period under the administration of the Gates County Court. During 1779, the Gates County Court bound Benjamin Robbins to learn the art of plantation business. Oh, they bound him so he can go to college, basically. You got bounded to go to college, learn the plantation business, because you're going to have one soon, son. Under James Garrett Sr. Less than 2 years later, the court placed Benjamin Robbins and Elisha Robbins under the care of Jethro Miltier to learn an unspecified trade. That same year, the court also bound Joshua or Joseph Bennett, Joshua, Joseph Bennett, all Hebrew names, and George Bennett, each described as an Indian boy, in order to learn the trades of shoemaking and barrel making. Into the 19th century, the court forced other Chowan boys into similar arrangements, all right? Doing this to indigenous people, all right? And also children of some of these Sephardic people, because they were mixing in with, females, indigenous women. So, a lot of them, again, it's both. These apprenticeships symbolize to Chowans and Europeans alike that the local government had full political power over the Chowans. Historian Margaret D. Jacobs has argued that removing children from their families allowed officials to punish native people for past resistance, all right? Because these people were in resistance since the moment these Europeans got here. They were punishing them all these years, selling their land, making them Christian, giving them the worst part of the land, and places where they couldn't grow, disfranchising them, calling them colored. The boys' apprenticeships crippled the Chowans' ability to maintain independent households and challenge Chowans' women's parental rights and claims to their children's labor. Political domination, however, did not represent the total collapse of the Chowans' connections to one another. Even with the end of their political independence, at least one Chowans and their descendants retained bonds of kingship, alliance, and shared homeland. The court's invasion of Chowan home life through the apprenticeship system likely helped to destroy the last symbol of Chowan autonomy, the reservation. 4 of the apprentice boys, made up of the chief men and representatives of the Chowan Indian Nation of the county gates, who sold the remaining acreage of the reservation to William Lewis and Samuel Harrell in 1790. All right, see what happened to a lot of these people, the indigenous people. Lacking an effective political apparatus and reservation lands, the Chowans, in the minds of local officials, were no longer Indians. Paper genocide. By the end of the 18th century, local officials ceased using the term Indian when describing the Chowans and their descendants. All right, reclassified. You took your whole identity. Continuing, it says, although local officials no longer chose to categorize them as Indians, the Chowans and their descendants remain in Gates County and surrounding counties, often maintained connection with King, and understood they were the area's original people. As free people of color, they function within as a part of a larger society with Europeans, other free people of color, and slaves. All right, they function with all these people. All right, other people of color. What other people and what slaves? As in previous generations, 19th and 20th century Chowans continued to adapt and respond to social and environmental changes, yet their adaptations and responses never symbolized their disappearance or lessening of their connection to their ancestral past. Local officials believed that people could fit in one racial category in one moment in time and fall into another classification based on perceived changes in their behavior or political situation. You see that? You heard that? Which reveals the cognitive dimensions behind the process of racialization. All right? You got to understand what these census and records mean, a lot of the time, because they're going off political situations and behaviors, perceived notions and changes. All right, the persistence of the Chowans and their descendants on the various racial categories demonstrate how little these racial divisions tell us about the histories of an individual. How little. You can't base people off a word that says black, colored, or Negro. You think you know that person is from a specific continent because you heard those 3 words? Come on, they're telling you right here. It demonstrates how little these racial divisions tell us about the histories of individuals. Communal landholding was long tested aspect of life for generations of Chowans that lasted after the Reservation era. In 1782, James Benjamin Patience, Sarah, and also called Sally, Nanny, also called Nancy. I think I ran into these people. Elizabeth, Darkies, or Darks, and Christian, also called Kitty Robbins, sometimes referred to collectively as the children of Nan Robbins. I swear I probably run into these people doing somebody's genealogy. They sound very familiar to me. Purchased from Henry Hill a 30-acre tract of land that became known as Indian Town, right? Indian Town. Some of these individuals, their descendants, and allied families lived on and maintained this land until 1821. A large portion of Indian Town's residents are likely represented among the 16 people counted in the household of James Robbins in the 1790 federal census, all right? The 1810 federal census best illustrates the makeup of Indian Town during the latter part of its existence. Listed sequentially are the household of George Bennett, Dorcas Robbins, Sally Robbins, John Saunders, Lewis Robbins, Nancy Robbins, Jacob Robbins, James Robbins, and Keziah Price. The census taker counted all members of these households as other free persons. Oh, other free persons, right? A category used for free non-whites. All right, you know what that means? Other free persons, otherwise so-called colored or so-called Negro or dark-skinned person, other than non-whites, not whites or non-Europeans, meaning native people, indigenous people. Is that what it means? All other free persons, indigenous people. Is that what it really means? Historical records do not reveal whether John Saunders and Keziah Price were Chowan descendants, but their families married Chowan descendants. Their presence suggests that the Chowans used Indian Town to shelter their own people as well as their allies and friends. All right, Chowans marrying who? All these other people. Who are they? Keziah and John Saunders. All right, again, sheltering them as well. And it was a family thing. It wasn't just a evil European guy coming and raping anybody. No, a lot of the time it's just love and the amalgamation. They loved each other. They mixed in. They probably had the same beliefs. You never know. In 1810s, the people who resided in Indian Town appeared to have lived with little threat to their communal property until a lawsuit allowed their neighbor John Walton to gain an interest in the land. In 1815, Henry Pugh sued Darkis and John Robbins for $20 after they failed to pay the amount guaranteed in an 1812 promissory note. The Gates County Court required Darkis and John Robbins to pay £10 plus interest along with court costs, a sum neither could pay. With the defendants unable to pay the fine, the court allowed a public auction of a 6-acre share of Indian Town. All right, see what they did? They gave it another part away, which was supposed to represent Darker Robbins' share in the original 1782 purchase. John Walton was the highest bidder and became part owner of the Indian Town tract. With partial ownership in Indian Town, Walton took steps to secure greater share in the property and to further divest the Indian Town inhabitants of their communal land. Look, he was on a mission. He had a purpose. He had an agenda. On February 23rd, 1819, Walton convinced Christian Robbins, who never resided permanently in Indiantown. Look at this other Robbins brother. He wasn't even living there. He probably just gave it to him. He convinced him, it says here, convinced Christian Robbins, who never resided there permanently in Indiantown, to sell her interest in the property. All right, so now she sold out and gave her his part. You see how they do it? This with approximately 11 acres of Indiantown in his name. So this is an important thing. So these people had pans and all that, but you see, some people just sold it. They gave it away. It wasn't always robbery. It wasn't always a wrongful thing that somebody took land. This is real stuff that really happened. People actually sold their things on, they shouldn't have. Continue, it says, with approximately 11 acres of Indiantown in his name, Walton petitioned the Gates County Court to divide Indiantown into individual allotments among him, the remaining original grantees, and the heirs of a deceased grantee. In his February 1820 petition, Walton claimed that he had asked his cotenants to consent to a partition in the most friendly manner, and hoped they would have complied with this reasonable request. However, they rejected his request, intending and contriving to injure and oppress Walton. Although Walton had taken legally acceptable steps to acquire interest in Indiantown, the inhabitants of Indiantown did not view the homeland as territory that courts or any other entity, including the original purchasers of the land, could buy, sell, or use as collateral for debts. In a May 1821 petition countering Walton's claim, Sarah Robbins, Elizabeth Robbins, Tanny Robbins, Lewis Robbins, and Judith Robbins, along with Rachel Saunders, James Robbins, Jacob Robbins, Nancy Martin, James Bell Robbins, Celia Martin, Tamar Robbins, Jacob Robbins the Younger, Blake Robbins, Noah Robbins, John Robbins, Kingston Robbins, Seth Robbins, and George Bennett declared that they were the true and absolute proprietors and owners of the tract of land called Indiantown, and denied that Walton had any right, title, or interest in the disputed lands. The inhabitants of Indiantown displayed a fundamentally different understanding of land ownership than Walton and the court. They did not view the original purchasers of Indiantown as individual shareholders. The original grantees purchased Indiantown for the benefit of all their people. They believed that even those individuals, such as George Bennett, who were alive during the original purchase in 1782, but did not sign the deed, still shared in the communal ownership of use of the land. In a sense, the inhabitants of Indiantown acted more as a cooperative venture than individual shareholders who could sell their separable shares to whomever they pleased. Nevertheless, as generations of disputes between the Chowans and their neighbors foreshadowed, the court sided with Walton. All right, again, this court, everybody's just, doing the wrong thing, right? Going with the wrong decision when it comes to the Chowans. Called for a division of the Indiantown and brought an end to centuries of collective land ownership among the Chowans and their descendants. A team assembled by the court surveyed the Indiantown tract and divided the land among Walton, Sarah, Nancy, and Elizabeth Robbins, and the heirs of Patience Robbins, Lewis, Judith, Tanny, and Tracy, also called Teresa or Teresi Robbins. Walton now had his share of Indiantown, but was not completely satisfied with the resultant situation. After the division, he sued the holders of the other partitions of Indiantown for the cost of the legal proceedings. The court quickly awarded Walton a judgment against the Robbins for 1809. Unable to pay the costs, for the court seized and placed up for public auction the Robinsons' land. Do you hear what happened? Do you see how dirty they did them? All right, so from the beginning, the whole history we've been reading, right? The whole history, they've been done wrong. People have been doing dirty things to them. Even up to the 1800s, look what's going on. This guy Walton, now they lost their land because they couldn't pay. So he sued him because he decided to go to court. So he sued him, right? Oh man. So unable to pay the cost, the court seized and placed up the public auctions of the Robinsons' land. At the sale, Walton bought the remainder of Indiantown. He bought the remainder. You see how evil that is? That's a plan. And in collusion with the courts, he successfully divested the Chowans and their descendants of their last piece of communally held land. You see, now that's dirty. Now you see, now this is very dirty. They did it legally, but they did it very dirty to corruption. He had the courts probably paid. He had money. He was probably, in secret societies, things like that. This is really dirty. See how they lost their land at the end of the day, in the 1800s. So by the 1600s, they weren't doing good things by, selling their land either way in the beginning. I know they probably had to or forced to. Something was going on, A lot of those people didn't really care about, there was more about the money most likely. But these people try to keep, whatever little bit they had, and they got done wrong. Chowans and their descendants likely had been leaving the area since the beginning of the reservation period and resettling outside the vicinity of the reservation. The possibility also lingers that some Chowans after 1677 treaty never settled on the reservation. Evidence from surrounding counties support the hypotheses long after the disappearance of Thomas Hitter from Chowan land sales and court cases in 1740. Free people of color in Currituck, Camden, Pasquotank, and Perkins counties used the Hitter surname. Members of the Hitter family born in the late 18th century carried the first name John and Thomas, the names of Chowan leaders. A witness in 1818 case involving Abram Hitter, whose name appears in Pasquotank County, records describe him of the offspring of a white woman and an Indian. A white woman and an Indian, says here. These free people of color were likely Chowan descendants. So, all right. So if she's from a white woman and an Indian, then where's the so-called black coming from? Must be from the Indian, right? If she's the white. So they're being classified as free people of color. Although their ties to the group in Gates County remains unclear, free people of color with other Chowan names such as Bennett and Robbins and no documentable direct ties to the Gates County contingent appear in Currituck and Chowan counties. The 1800 federal census for Currituck County presents an interesting situation in which a Samuel Robbins lived 5 households from a Rachel Bennett in what appears to be a settlement of free people of color. All right. So I just want to go to this picture real quick. Right here, you see? It says this is Andrew Jackson Robbins, a Chowan descendant, was the son of Noah Robbins, one of the petitioners in the legal dispute over Indian Town. He lived in Bertie County before settling it in neighboring Hartford County during the Civil War. Andrew Jackson Robbins served with the 34th U.S. Colored Infantry. All right, Andrew Jackson Robbins served with the U.S. Colored Infantry. Photograph courtesy of the Winston family. All right, I'm going to go ahead and colorize this. All right, so this is Andrew Jackson Robbins. All right, a little bit colorized. All right, Andrew Jackson Robbins. All right, get another picture here. A little bit more enhanced. All right, Andrew Jackson Robbins. Andrew Jackson Robbins. All right, Andrew Jackson Robbins. All right, I'm gonna go back. All right, so that's the black and white version. Andrew Jackson Robbins, right, a Chowan descendant. Of the Chowan descendants who moved away from Gates County, the brothers Parker D. and Augustus Robbins made especially important contributions to their adopted communities. Their work during and after the Civil War provides examples of how Chowan descendants not only found ways to integrate themselves into the larger body politic, but also shape the political and societal discourses in their locality. Born in Gates County, both men came to Bertie County sometime before the Civil War. Parker D. Robbins purchased property next to his kinsman, Noah Robbins, who had established himself in the county at least by 1850. Both men provided invaluable service to the Bertie County community, Parker as a mechanic and Augustus as a barber. Parker was particularly skilled and later held 2 patents on his own inventions. During the Civil War, both men escaped to Union-occupied Virginia, joined the 2nd United States Colored Cavalry, and rose up the ranks, Parker to Sergeant Major and Augustus to Quartermaster Sergeant. After the war, both men took their Army leadership experience back to Bertie County and became engaged in Reconstruction politics. They took roles in local administration before election to the North Carolina General Assembly. Parker was among the first group of non-white men to serve as representatives in the state legislature. The Chowan descendants who continued to live in Gates County both thrived and struggled in the mostly agricultural community. None gained the same level of position as the Robbins brothers in Bertie County, but most found their niche in society. According to census records, some descendants farmed, while others, as common laborers, Those lucky enough to own their farms could accumulate significant amounts of property, which in itself could buy some level of respect from neighbors who viewed wealth as a symbol of hard work. In 1855, account of sale for the state of William Robbins, a farmer and a small landholder, provides some insight into the assets of one generally successful Chowan descendant. William's estate included typical farming instruments such as hoes and axe, livestock, and home goods, including bed, furniture, and an old loom and wheel. His most valuable asset, besides 15 barrels of corn, was an old mare that sold for $13.25. William was not rich, but he had the basic holdings of an independent yeoman. Chowan descendants not only found a place in the Gates County economy, but also participated in local electoral politics. The extent of Chowan descendants' involvement is unclear because most pre-Civil War Gates County election records no longer exist. All right, they say it no longer exists. However, one voter list shows that at least one Chowan descendant cast a ballot in a local election before North Carolina disfranchised free men of color in 1835. Before what? Before what happened? Again, Kurimeo, hold up. Before what happened? Yeah, before North Carolina disfranchised free men of color in 1835. Paper genocide. In 1795, Benjamin Robbins voted in an election for a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. All right, we're talking about before even slavery was over. But before we continue, I just wanted to go show this image right here as well of this individual right here. As you can see, it says this is Parker David Robbins, a Chowan descendant, was born in Gates County in 1834. Robbins, along with his brother Augustus Robbins, left Gates County at an early age and settled in Bertie County. Both brothers served in the U.S. Colored Cavalry during the Civil War. After the war, Parker and Augustus Robbins represented Bertie County in the North Carolina General Assembly. Tintype of Parker Robbins, courtesy of the North Carolina Museum of History, Raleigh. All right. Again, this is the black and white version. All right. Now let's go look at the colorized version. All right. So here's a colorized version. Go to this one right here. All right. Continuing says, as the examples of brothers Parker D. and Augustus Robbins, William Robbins, and Benjamin Robbins reveal, Chowan descendants by the mid-19th century had become well integrated into the larger society. They no longer operated on the periphery, but participated to the extent that their skills, reputation, and the law would allow. Although those Chowan descendants, like their predecessors, had made significant changes in their life ways, and now were perceived by their neighbors as colored people. Now they're all of a sudden colored people, right? You hear this? So you see, paper genocide, right? How many times did this happen to people in the Americas, in North America, right? There are so-called, colored people that were eventually called colored people. Could it be the similar story? Yes, right? Yes, I bet you it is. When you start researching, a lot of them, many of them. With all the social and legal restrictions attached to that categorization, neither they nor their neighbors had completely forgotten their connection to the past. During the last quarter of the century, the ethnologist James Mooney sent surveys to several southeastern sites to inquire about local names of Indian origin and people of pure or mixed Indian blood. In the vicinity, at least 2 of these surveys made their way to the Gates County. Responding to the question about individuals of pure or mixed Indian blood, one informant provided the names of Jethro Bell and Allen Reed and described both as 1/4 Indian. A second informant, Blake Smith, a Chowan descendant, answered the same question by providing the names of Jethro and Isaac Urey, Jethro Bell and Jethro Urey being the same person, and explaining that there are a good many individuals of pure or mixed Indian blood in this township, and a good part of them are halves or 2/3 Indian blood. In response to a question about Indian remains in the area, Smith mentioned Indian Town and an area called Indian Neck, which contained a graveyard where the original Indians were buried. You hear that? Smith further explained that in Indian Neck there are several hundred acres of land that used to belong to the Indians. The mention of Indians may have been missing from the official records of Gates County, but county residents, especially the Chowans' descendants, still remembered a great deal about the past. They were trying to erase their history. Even during the early 20th century, Gates County residents still understood that names such as Indian Neck were attached to a people, and that the descendants of those people still lived in the vicinity. In 1905, Congress approved the creation of a fund for members of the Eastern Band of Cherokees. Thousands of claims came to the attention of Chowan Miller, whose office sorted through and then approved the rejected applications, right? So they had to apply to be Cherokees. That's what I be telling people. Sometimes it could be a general term. A lot of people who weren't Cherokees eventually claimed Cherokee. Among these were over a dozen claims from individuals from Gates County, all right, Chowan people. The names, these were Algonquin Chowan people, right? Not Cherokees, but they were trying to get at least into the Eastern Band of Cherokees. The names Chowan or Chowanoke appear to have disappeared from the collective memory of Gates County descendants, and as in many cases of people of Native descent in the Southeast, the name Cherokee, all right, became their tribal affiliation. I told you, this happened to many people in the South. That's why we only got Cherokee and Blackfoot as the general, like, you know, my grandma's Cherokee or Blackfoot, but there's a broader, there could be so many things into saying Cherokee or even Blackfoot, all right? It became their tribal affiliation, but it really wasn't. Cherokee appears to have become synonymous with Indian for most 19th century North Carolinians who had long forgotten names like Chowan, right? Chowan, right? So what is it telling you here? Are you really Cherokee? Remember, Cherokee that word wasn't around before Europeans. Although they had no awareness of a connection to the Chowan or Chowanoke names, the Chowan descendants who applied for Cherokee benefits provided details of their heritage, some of which are at least partially confirmed by other documents, all right? So even though they were applying, they're like, look, we're Chowan, but we need, we want to be recognized at least as some native, The Chowan descendants were adamant about their native heritage and provided Chowan Miller with detailed information about their history. Little did they know that the stories they told were not about Cherokees, but Chowans. In 1907, Betsy Smith provided an extensive genealogy going back to her father, Blake Robbins. So they didn't know either. Okay, so I get it. These applicants were actually, they just thought they were Cherokees, but little did they know they were actually Chowans. This is what I was saying. A lot of people think they're, Cherokee, but they could be a lot other tribes, from the East Coast. But Betsy Smith provided an extensive genealogy going back to her father, Blake Robbins, one of the petitioners in the Indiantown dispute 86 years before. She named her father's siblings, some of whom also appeared on that petition. Confident that she was a descendant of Native people, Betsy expounded, "If I have failed to state any of the necessary things in my application, and you will let me know what is necessary, and I can of right establish the point, I shall be glad to do so." She invited the commissioner to her community to take a look at me, and aware that the word of people of color in the South was not always taken seriously, further suggested that the commissioner could confirm the facts from the white people of this county. Oh, Betsy knew that Chowan descendants as well as whites were cognizant of the histories of the native descendant people in her community. Details provided in the applications of Sarah Elizabeth Smith Green and Isaac Urey support continuity between the people of the past and Chowan descendants living during the first decade of the 20th century. Sarah Green mentioned the name of her grandfather Blake Robbins and gave details about the lives of her forebears. She wrote to Chowan Miller, "My grandparents lived in the same neighborhood as did my immediate parents, in that part of Gates County, North Carolina, known until this day as Indiantown." In his application, Isaac Urey remarked that all of my people lived in that part of Gates County, North Carolina, known as Indiantown. Indiantown was not a place lost to the past, but was part of the lived experience of Chowan descendants in the early 20th century. Jethro Ure provided a particularly detailed application that displayed his strong awareness of past events and conflicts between native and non-native peoples. Jethro explained that he was the son of James Robbins and grandson of Sally Robbins, who was one of the original purchasers of the Indiantown tract. In a letter to Guion Miller, Jethro provided the names of some of the old Indians, all which can be confirmed by the 1821 petition and other documents. He also gave a brief account of the removal of the Chowans from their land, likely Indiantown. Describing the removal of the old Indians from their land, Jethro suggested that they were driven from it without being compensated. So he's like, you actually owe us something. Hold up. The transactions and deeds concerning Indiantown confirm this description. The Chowan descendants never received money for the land. Jethro's statement also provides important insight into the Chowan's position concerning the land sale. In the memory of the Chowan descendants, the land was stolen from them, right? And not acquired through legitimate means, as the Gates County records suggest. All right, something happened, they erased the history, all right? Something dirty did go down here, and the descendants remember, and they're like, no, it was taken illegally. At some point after the death of Betsy Smith, Sarah Green, Isaac Ure, and Jethro Ure, memories of Indiantown faded away. But many Chowan descendants families in the 21st century continue to have memories of an Indian past. All right. In recent years, I have met many Chowan descendants. Some have been aware of their Chowan heritage, while others simply remember their grandmother's claims of being part Cherokee Indian. All right. So there we go again. Her grandma was saying Cherokee, but she didn't, remember a lot of things that happened since the 1600s, right? For them to get disfranchised, remember? Disfranchised in the Chowas in the 1830s. So they just knew Cherokee. Many modern-day descendants grew up hundreds of miles from Gates County, whereas others live right across the Chowan River in adjacent Hertford County. A small contingent continues to live in Gates County in walking distance of no more apt a place than Indian Neck Road. I want to show her now. All right. It says Mary Emma Ure, a Chowan descendant, was the daughter of Isaac Ure, an applicant for Eastern Cherokee benefits. All right, she was applying for the Eastern Cherokee benefits, but that's because they had no other choice. She spent most of her life in the vicinity of Indiantown and the old reservation, photographed courtesy of the Ure family. All right, so here's a colorized version of Mary Emma Ure. All right, Chowan descendant, Chowan Indian descendant. Okay, a little more enhanced picture. All right, Mary Emma Ure, a Chowan Indian descendant, American Indigenous person descendant. All right. Continuing, says here, from the colonial period through the 19th century, Chowans and their descendants lost control of their collective land holdings, experienced drastic changes in their political organization and life ways, and underwent a mass racial recategorization. All right, today they're being called African Americans. You understand? You overstand? That altered their legal and political status. Nevertheless, none of these deviations from the past brought an end to the Chowans and their descendants. The example of the Chowans revealed that scholars must look deeper into the archives. All right, scholars, all right, so-called scholars, all you scholars out there, you must look deeper into the archives, all right, and not simply look for race terms. Don't just be looking for so-called black, so-called color, so-called mulatto, so-called white. Don't be looking for those race terms, but also examine genealogies and track migrations. Do your genealogy. Do you understand your family's migration patterns? Do you understand where you're really coming from? This is deep. This is what you find out when you do your genealogy. They must approach their research with a clear understanding that racial categorization was not necessarily constant. It kept changing. The inconsistent categorization of the Chowans and their descendants reveals the limit of using race as a tool of analysis and exploring social divides in colonial and post-colonial societies. Individuals often fall into various racial categorizations, and racial histories are nebulous. Do the Chowans and their descendants belong in the historical narratives of American Indians or African Americans? Huh? Huh? The Chowan story reveals the weakness of either of these constructed narratives. The property describes the social realities. The racial categorization of the Chowans should not mitigate the importance of life stories of the Chowan's descendants who lived as colored. Scholars should continue to examine how the descendants of the Americas, pre-1492 descendants of Americans who were here pre-1492 population have dealt with colonialism, slavery, genocide, all right, and removal from their lands. Racial categorization is not a human attribute, but a reflection of human beliefs about the world. This historical reality should foreground research on all racialized peoples in order to prevent scholars from overlooking the connections and similarities among people which belief in race as reflection of social reality seeks to obfuscate. All right? The connections and similarities among people. We might be more family than you think. All right? So a little bit about the person who wrote this article. It says Dr. Miltier received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and is an assistant professor of history at Virginia Tech. He received the R.D.W. Connor Award for his article, Life in a Great Dismal Swamp Community, Three People of Color in Pre-Civil War Gates County, North Carolina, published in April 2014. North Carolina Historical Review. He has also published The Strategies of Forbidden Love, Family Across Racial Boundaries in 19th Century North Carolina, in the Journal of Social History, spring 2014, and he wishes to thank Kathleen Duvall, Greg O'Brien, and the anonymous reviewers for the North Carolina Historical Review for their valuable comment and suggestions on earlier versions of this article. He would also like to acknowledge the staff of the State Archives of North Carolina and Forrest Hazel for helping to procure sources for the article, and members of the Roberts, Urey, and Winston families for sharing family pictures. This article is dedicated to the memory of Karen Roberts and Caroline Robbins Winston. All right. You guys are not forgotten. Thank you for sharing your story. Fair use. All right. Again, this was From Indians to Colored People. All right. From Indians to Colored People. The problem of racial categories and the persistence of the Chowans in North Carolina. The North Carolina Historical Review, Volume 93, Number 1. Thanks for sticking around and reading 30 pages with me. You guys are awesome. Much love and respect. Hawa.